How should drug companies handle the coronavirus pandemic? Pharmaceutical firms rushing to find a vaccine could potentially make billions of dollars. So, what must be done to ensure they don't put profit before saving lives? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mariam Namazi. Scientists around the world are now racing to find a vaccine and a cure for the coronavirus. Governments are pledging millions of dollars of taxpayers' money for research in both public and private firms. The global vaccine market is estimated to be worth nearly $60 billion annually. Pharmaceutical companies have been criticised in the past for being too slow in combating diseases like SARS and Ebola and charging high prices for new drug treatments. The President of the European Commission hopes a vaccine will be available, though, later this year.
In addition, we are accelerating research. Yesterday, I spoke to the managers of an innovative European research company. They work on a promising technology to develop a vaccine against the coronavirus. The European Union provides them up to 80 million euros, and I hope that with this support, we can have a vaccine on the market perhaps before autumn.
So let's bring in our panel. Joining us from here in London, Gustave Ando, Executive Director for the Economics and Country Risk Life Sciences Practice at IHS Markit. From Miami, Gerald Posner, investigative journalist and author of Pharma, Greed, Lies and the Poisoning of America. And also here in London, Andre Spicer, Professor of Organisational Behaviour at Cass Business School at City University of London. Very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us on the programme. So, we've been speaking about the impact the coronavirus pandemic is having on businesses, big and small. They're all taking a hit, but there are some businesses and industries that do stand to profit, perhaps none more so than the pharmaceutical industry. Gerald, you have said that pharmaceutical companies now stand to gain a once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity from COVID-19. Why have you said that?
Yeah, it's a cold calculus, Marianne, no question. And there are going to be winners and losers inside the drug industry. The winners are going to be among the 22 to 26 drug companies and biotech firms that are racing right now to try to get a vaccine. There are billions of dollars literally that will be funded from governments, private research, academic centers. And those pharmaceutical companies, the first one that crosses the line, in your lead-in you talked about the possibility of this autumn, but even if it's a year to 18 months, the first one that crosses the line gets the vaccine that governments say that's the one we want. We have to deploy it literally to hundreds of millions of people. They're going to be able to make a profit on that at that point.
Right. So, Gustave, let me ask you then, what are your thoughts on that? How much profit do these companies stand to make? Just how lucrative could a COVID-19 vaccine, medicine, antiretroviral drug be for them?
Well, let's first be very clear that we have no guarantee that that's going to be the case whatsoever, that we even get to having a vaccine or treatment here. There are, I think as most of us know, inherent risks in developing treatment with a very, very high failure rate. And so therefore, we just simply don't know. I mean, we're expecting to see clinical data fairly soon on some of the early activity that we've seen. But in terms of the actual opportunity, it's fairly limited, right? So as has been highlighted here, it'll be maybe 2 or 3 companies at most that might be able to succeed out of this. And for them, you know, if we're talking about vaccines, which is a very specific kind of industry, the margins are typically razor thin, right? It's very hard to scale the production in any meaningful and profitable way, and only a really handful of companies can actually do that and manage it.
Andre, tell me, what have we been seeing in terms of how investors have been reacting in the past few weeks to pharmaceutical companies, particularly those that say they're working on vaccine and drug programs? What are we seeing in the market?
I suppose what we've seen is that these companies are inherently risky, but they tend to have quite high profit margins. So the largest US drug companies have profit margins of 13% versus far lower for many other companies. So they're in many ways a good bet. The other thing to note is that these firms have often spent a lot of their money not doing research and development, but buying their own shares back. So according to one calculation, they've spent, I think, more buying their own shares back from, I think, up to 2017 than they had done on research and development. And some of the firms that are currently racing to develop a vaccine, this is indeed the case for them. So you need to ask this question of whose money is being spent on research and development, partially the companies, but it's often partially public funds. And the question is who has to then pay for it. So it's often the public pays twice.
Gerald, the problem with this is that running a company, a pharmaceutical company, is very expensive. I mean, I appreciate what Andre is saying there about perhaps these companies not spending as much on research and development as certain government-funded agencies, but we know that running these sort of companies is expensive, and without a profit, well, they either shrink, they are either sold to another company, or they simply die.
No question about it. Look, it's a for-profit business. I understand that. The United States is the only country that's crazy enough on the planet to allow drug companies unfettered power in setting their own prices, list prices. Every other country has some form of negotiations. What Professor Spicer said is absolutely critical. In the U.S., for example, the National Institutes of Health, which is a public health agency funded by taxpayer money, has since the 1930s, I talk about this in a chapter called The Coming Pandemic, since the 1930s, they have spent $900 billion on public research, which pharmaceutical companies have then taken and put under patents and made billions of dollars. The first HIV drug treatment, AZT, was actually the result only of work done at the federal level with federal money and government sponsorship. The only thing Burroughs, who had the patent, did was provide the underlying drug, and they couldn't even make it because they weren't producing it. It was a patent they held, and it wasn't even in production. So what happened is they made billions of dollars from the U.S. government research and efforts of academic work. None of that came back to the public for further scientific research. That's the part of this that is
Gerald,
outrageous.
just to get, I mean, so that the research and development side is crucial here. Making a profit is important for research and development. Research and development is crucial for there to be scientific, medical breakthroughs, particularly at a time like this. Now, how much does the industry spend on research and development?
It's a great figure because the industry says that it spends about 20 to 22% on research and development, 4% less than they spend on marketing and promotion in the United States. And Marianne, here's the real question that you need to ask. Gustav talked before about only a couple of winners, and he's right in terms of getting the patent maybe on moving forward with the vaccine. But then there are manufacturing firms. They're all drug companies. The only ones able to do this are drug companies. And what's our experience in the U.S.? It's terrible, because the only time since in modern history since World War II when a U.S. president, Gerald Ford, ordered a national inoculation program for all Americans for the swine flu back in '76, the Ford drug companies chosen by the government to manufacture the product, 100 million doses of the vaccine, they withheld
right,
it.
But I mean, Gerald, look, they say, I mean, I think you had several pharmaceutical bosses testifying before Congress last year. I mean, this is a long-running issue. It comes up again and again. They were asked, why do drugs in the UK cost so much? Because like you said, there's a big differential with how it works in the US compared to the rest of the world. They are saying, look, it is the cost of research and development. And not only that, they argue that America is shouldering that burden for the rest of the world.
That's true as well. But, you know, the one question I have is, and I'm sure that Gustav and Professor Spicer are following this, those of us who have a microscope on pharma, we in the United States passed a congressional bill the other day with the president, $8.3 billion emergency funding. There was a difference between the first draft and what was passed. What was different? The pharmaceutical lobby got in and took out two clauses, one of them relating to limits on the amount of profit that they could make so the third world and developing nations could be fed eventually with this vaccine. And the other was that if they worked in the program and then dropped out, they want to keep their own intellectual property. The government wanted it to be shared by everybody. They get to keep their intellectual property. You know, if we don't keep our eye on the ball now, everybody's worried about the vaccine and health. They should be. I understand this is a deadly virus. But if we don't watch also at the government level what pharmaceutical companies are doing...
But Gustav, let me come to you because, I mean, look, you have a profit-driven pharmaceutical... I mean, this is the business model, isn't it? This is the model that exists. We desperately need these companies right now. We've always relied upon vaccines and medicines. You might say that the model is a weakness in the global health system, but it is the system that currently exists. It's a profit-driven model.
It is a profit-driven model, but let's also be clear that the U.S., as has been mentioned here, is really kind of the exception, right? So the U.S., in terms of its healthcare system, is very unique and has a lot of very complex and multifaceted characteristics that you just don't see almost anywhere else. So, over here in Europe, for example, and most other countries around the world, you have a negotiated price. And if the manufacturer and the government cannot agree on a price, the drug is not available. And there are many cases of that happening.
So you're saying
right?
there needs to be more regulation, more price controls in the US?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so you're saying there needs to be more regulation, more price controls in the US. How would that affect the development and distribution of a vaccine for coronavirus?
I don't think it's my place to say what a country should and shouldn't do. There are all sorts of reasons why healthcare systems are built the way that they are, and there are plenty of problems with healthcare systems outside of the U.S. But certainly the model that has been built, let's be very clear, is very successful, and we have successfully converted many deadly diseases into what were previously deadly diseases into chronic illnesses. And for example, hepatitis C is a very good and very recent example of that.
Andre, a different way of looking at this perhaps is that when drugs do get expensive, does it draw more product to market? The more expensive they become, the more profits you see, the more investors that draws in. And it's kind of like any other commodity, that it would hopefully lead to more innovation. Isn't that the rationale?
So in many ways, it's kind of a bit of a winner-takes-all market. So you have to take very long-term bets on there's certain diseases. So you make a calculation. This disease is worth solving, which normally means it's a first-world disease where there's either governments or individuals with the money to pay for it. Then you take a bet over a 10, 20-year period. I'm going to develop vaccines around, or products around that. And then most of those don't work out. So that money's gone. But then one or two of those will become big blockbuster drugs, which will then fund everything else. So you have to take a long time horizon. The other thing to note here is that investors are increasingly looking for kind of the ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance returns on it. So they're looking in terms of their portfolio and they're saying, how is this firm performing in a socially responsible way? So if drug companies can show that they're doing socially responsible things, it's likely that people providing capital, which is pension funds, etc., are likely to be more favourable to give that money to those drug companies versus companies who are behaving in an irresponsible way.
Gerald, really, how far does that apply right now? Because I suppose if you break it down in a simple way, no company is going to run clinical trials for something where they don't stand to make any money. So even if the scientists said, OK, let's get together and do this research and do this on our own, let's set up our own company, they still have to get the funding from venture capitalists or whatever. So you can't get funding unless there's a return to be made on the investment.
But here's where the return is, I think, in a way, Marianne, which is interesting for some of the drug companies. And I'm talking every day, by the way, to infectious disease experts who were former pharma executives before they've gone out on their own back to research. If a company gets involved and gets public funding for this, with this flood of money that will be coming from CEPI and from the U.S. government and for others, they get involved in the research. They don't get a product. They don't get far enough along. They don't develop the real vaccine that's used. They still are able to keep the intellectual property from that work that they do with public funding that might help them on development of antivirals, on other matters. I mean, Gilead and Hep C, Gustav was talking about is one of the great success stories, both in terms of profits and in terms of helping people. It's that type of information they need for the rest of their drug line that they may be able to get some help on with antivirals. They get involved in this research and they get it paid for by the government or private institutions. It's a win for them, even if they don't get into the final product.
Right. So, Gustav, these are public companies. They are really there to serve the shareholder. What are we saying? That they shouldn't necessarily be public? I know you don't want to make, broad sweeping statements on what governments or what should or shouldn't happen. But when you are looking at something as severe as finding a vaccine or a medicine or some kind of treatment to manage an illness that's created the crisis that we have now, is this precisely the sort of research that governments should be funding? You can't just leave it to pharmaceuticals.
Well, I don't think that a drastic solution like what you're proposing there is really on the cards, or really what anyone would really want out of this, including those who are very, very critical of the pharmaceutical sector, right? There's a reason why we've had so many successes in whether it's oncology or hepatitis C or HIV/AIDS in terms of improving patients' lives and indeed curing illnesses, and to be in a position where we can, with a degree of confidence, say that we're probably going to have a successful vaccine or treatment for COVID-19 probably by this time next year, which would be absolutely unprecedented in the history of healthcare, right? To be able to identify the genome sequence of this disease, which was done in early January, and a year later to effectively have potentially a treatment.
Yeah, but then you have the problem of scaling up, of distribution. Absolutely. Is it going to be accessible?
Absolutely.
I mean, I suppose if we look at the timescale then, because you've said that probably the expectation is that we could see something early next year, and that is the key question: how long it could take to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, and when might it be ready? Gerald, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Gustav's absolutely right. First of all, a year to 18 months may sound slow to the lay public. It's a speed record in terms of pharmaceutical companies for a vaccine like this. And he also said early on, we are all assuming, and the infectious disease people I speak to daily believe they will get a vaccine on this. But remember, it was just last year, 2019, when the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, finally approved a vaccine for Ebola. 46 years after it first was discovered in the
So why did it take so long? Is it getting harder to find vaccines for infectious diseases?
Sometimes it's hard. Why don't we have a vaccine today for HIV or AIDS? It's out from the mid-1980s because it's hard to necessarily develop a vaccine for a virus that doesn't have so many side effects that you don't want to distribute or inoculate mass groups of people. But in this case, on this particular virus, I do believe they will be able to come up with a vaccine. It's related in a sort of a chemical way and in a microbial way to what we had in H1N1 in 2009. They stopped vaccine research on that because it went away in the next season. But this time, I think they will find one.
We were hearing earlier in the program that, Andre, that 2 or 3 companies are likely to benefit from this. Which companies and whereabouts in the world are you watching very closely? Who might be best placed or best positioned to come up with a solution?
Well, so there's a range of companies that are in the race. So you have Sanofi, I think it's a French firm. There's small biotech firms which are in the US, Moderna. You've got Chinese firms. So they're spread across the world. The other thing to note, which is interesting, is that while they're kind of racing each other, there's a lot of networks where there's kind of information sharing going on. So despite the fact that large pharmaceutical firms will kind of protect information and patents they have, they also share a lot of information. So for instance, GSK, big UK firm, had shared some information, which sort of patents and so forth, which would be very useful for developing the vaccine. So pharmaceutical companies aren't just these kind of hoarders of information and profiting off it. Often they'll share information, particularly when you have these kind of big global races.
How important? Yeah, let me get your thoughts on that, Gerald. It seems as though we're seeing evidence of information sharing on this. Yes, pharmaceutical companies are in a race. Yes, they want to maximize their profits, but at the same time, the coordination between them will be crucial to expediting some sort of vaccine.
Yeah, what you just said, what Professor Spicer brought up, is absolutely critical. They have to share information on this. CEPI, the international organization that's supposed to coordinate vaccines, backed off that position a little bit, but they're trying to push that now. And we all have to remember that in one of the greatest modern inventions in pharmaceutical history, penicillin, saved hundreds and millions of lives, stopping infections across the board. That was the result of a crash effort between the British team at Oxford that had really worked it out and the U.S. government that put it on right behind the atomic bomb as a World War II priority, brought in 10 pharmaceutical firms that shared all the information. There was no holding back.
But tell me, Gerald, what's happening now? Because obviously, we have this global pandemic. Are we seeing regulators collaborate with vaccine producers? Is enough action being taken to accelerate the timeline?
Now, unfortunately not. I don't see it. Maybe Gustav, Professor Spicer see it. I don't see it. Remember, the only reason we got it done on penicillin, we were in the middle of the war. There's no better incentive than a hot war. We're in a war now against this microbe, but that's different. People feel scared and they're anxious and they're very nervous, but it's different than the hot war. So World War II was the impetus to do that. We may get here on this pandemic, but we're not here yet.
Tell me, Gustav, how important are partnerships to developing and manufacturing vaccines and medicines for the public-private partnerships?
Oh, it's absolutely critical, right? And you know, one point I want to make here is that there is a reason why it takes sort of 6-7 years, right, to develop a drug successfully, and there's a really important reason for that. It takes that long to understand whether these experimental treatments are safe and effective, right? That what you see in the early testing data is not some quirk in the data, or that if side effects emerge much later on that you wouldn't have captured after a year of testing. Right, so there's a reason why we rarely, if ever, sort of approve new treatments with a shortened timeline.
Andre, it's a really good point. Andre, then what are your thoughts on that? Because the challenges for developing a vaccine, and as we've heard, there's no guarantee that there's going to be any silver bullet to this, but you need to think about long-term immunity, protection against mutations. There's so much we don't know about this phenomenon. Is it going to go away? Will it become seasonal? It's many challenges lie ahead.
Okay, so 2 points. One, when you do any big project, whether it's in pharma or infrastructure or whatever, you normally have a kind of what we call a trilemma. So 3 things you have to trade off. One is speed, one is cost, and one is sort of safety or quality. So, and the point is that most of the time you can only have 2 of those 3 things. So the question is really going to be with the COVID vaccine is, what's the trade-off? Which one are you going to be willing to sort of go backwards on? The second point is, the way pharmaceuticals actually do their work and operate, the way they build vaccines has kind of changed quite a lot in the last few years, particularly with the rise of big data. So not just relying on clinical trials for evidence, and increasingly they're relying on patient records. So having access to those patient records to see what the results are is critical about how they're actually developing these techniques.
I want to get a final thought from each of you on the question of if and when we see a vaccine, a medicine, some kind of treatment to manage this illness, is it going to be widely available, accessible and affordable? Gustav, you first.
Well, I think you'll see 2 phases of it, right? And let's really, fingers crossed, hope that we get to that stage where we actually have a treatment that's proved to be effective, right? So, but the first stage will be focused on the at-risk populations, you know, the front line of the healthcare workers, and clearly older and vulnerable populations, et cetera. That's going to be the first phase. And then wider sort of mass mobilization would happen after that, and you can kind of scale that up separately.
Gerald.
You know, I think, Marianne, across the Western world and the rest of the world, Asia and Africa, everybody is suffering from this pandemic, even though it's not infected. Airline industry, cruise industry, travel, businesses, people working out of home, we're all having to make a sacrifice. And what I'm saying is, I think the pharmaceutical industry doesn't have to lose money, but they have to make a bit of a sacrifice as well. They have to share in this epidemic by not only developing antivirals that will adapt and treat this before they have a virus or have a vaccine. And once they have the vaccine, let them make a profit, but let them have it as small a profit as possible. This isn't the pandemic on which to make a ton of money. And I hope that they follow that and serve the public good on this.
Andre.
So companies have spoken a lot about doing capitalism for the public good, and here's an opportunity to show that in practice, that they can actually use mechanisms of the firm and the financial markets to actually do public good rather than just withdraw value for themselves, their shareholders and their senior executives.
All right, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time of our guest today. Gustav Ando, Executive Director for the Economics and Country Risk Life Sciences Practice at IHS Markit from Miami, Gerald Posner, and then also here in London, Andre Spicer, joining us from City University of London. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting the website aljazeera.com. And then for further discussion and debate, you can go to the Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And then, of course, there's always Twitter. You can join the conversation there as well. The handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mariam Namazi, and the teams here in London and in Doha. Bye for now.